This is lecture 126 in the ABCs of Communism series, and this accompanies volume 7 that'll be forthcoming pretty quick. And what we're going to be talking about today is the liberation of Eastern Europe in the north by the Red Army. And what the planning of the 1943 offensive of the Red Army, as you may recall, began in April of that year. Stalin and his generals knew the Krauts were going to get an even worse ass-whipping than they had received in Moscow and Stalingrad in the early summer at Kursk, and they wanted then to go over to an immediate general offensive that would expel the Nazis from the motherland completely by 1944. The Kraut withdrawal from Kursk, as we saw last time, witnessed the wholesale abandonment of much of their equipment. Constant pursuit by Red units and partisan harassment continued until the onset of winter. Then the Red Army began preparing for a general offensive in 1944, and it didn't stop. The Germans anticipated that they would stop for the winter, but Stalin and the Stavka knew that they would anticipate that, and so their plan was just to continue hitting them. It was the fourth blow. The Red Army at Moscow delivered the first devastating blow against the Nazis in the winter of 41-42. The Red Army at Stalingrad delivered the second blow. The third blow at the Kursk salient finished off any possibility of the Nazis continuing against the USSR. And the coming fourth blow would destroy the entire Nazi Army Group center and lead to Stalin's crusade in Europe. Now, the first 1944 target was the liberation of Byelorussia, which today is called Belarus. Kraut Army Group Center had built trench defenses in depth using the swamps as connecting bulwarks. Its main force was the 3rd Panzer Army and 3 field armies. The Red Army would have to break through the German defenses in 6 sectors. It was to pin in the Kraut Center while destroying the Nazi forces on the flanks. Encircling Vitebsk in the north and Bobryansk in the south, Soviet armored and mechanized spearheads from both flanks were then to close a large encirclement of Minsk. Now that would trap Army Group Center's main forces east of that city, where they could be finished off. Simultaneously, there would be Red offensive against the Kraut Army Group's north and northern Ukraine, along the Vistula, Neru, and Bug rivers. The summer offensive plan featured Soviet air superiority and partisan attacks against fascist communications in rare areas. Coordinating operations was the job of the headquarters of the Supreme High Command, or Stavka, with Marshals Alexander Vasilevsky and George Zhukov overseeing planning and execution. Now, Soviet preparations were elaborate and highly secret, with Red tanks and artillery reserves scattered among many fronts. These and supporting assets had to be concentrated without giving away the plan. Now, accordingly, the Soviets employed extensive deception and operational security measures, including radio silence, night movements, rigid camouflage, discipline. In consequence, the Soviet High Command covertly marshaled against Army Group Center 20 combined arms armies, 2 tank armies, 5 air armies. Altogether, the Soviets counted 2.4 million troops in 172 divisions, 12 corps, 7 fortified regions, and 22 brigades of various types. Their armaments and equipment included 36,400 guns and mortars, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 5,300 aircraft. For operational direction, the major front-level commands were from north to south: the 1st Baltic under Ivan Bagramian, the 3rd Byelorussian generaled by Ivan Chernyakhovsky, 2nd Byelorussian by George Sakharov, and the 1st Byelorussian Army Group by Konstantin Rokossovsky. Now, that total number of Russian troops, around 2.4 million for that particular part of the front in their attack, is about 5 times what the Germans had. I just checked that a few minutes ago to be sure that was correct. And in terms of equipment, it was far superior to what the Germans had available. And the most important part is the Nazis had no idea that this was about to engulf them. So the first phase lasted from the 23rd of June to July of 1944. That is, the first phase of Bagration North in 1944 began on 23 June with breakthrough attacks rippling across the front from north to south of that front. Now by 27 June, the 1st Baltic and 3rd Byelorussian fronts had encircled and annihilated 5 German divisions at Vitebsk. Meanwhile, the 2nd Byelorussian front had crossed the Dniester to seize Mogilev on 28 June, and simultaneously the right wing of the 1st Byelorussian front encircled and destroyed 6 German divisions at Bobryansk. Now on the 3rd of July, advancing mobile groups from the north and south flanking Soviet fronts occupied Minsk, encircling to the east the German 4th and 9th Army with about 100,000 troops. Now as Soviet forward detachments pressed ever westward, they managed over the first 12 days of Bagration to reach a penetrating depth of 175 miles. Together with the 250-mile-wide breach in the Kraut front meant liberation of the entire Byelorussian SSR. Partisan sabotage of railroads and piecemeal Nazi replacement failed to reverse the fascist disintegration. The second phase of Bagration North was from 5 July to 29 August 1944, and between those dates, the German forces trapped east of Minsk attempted a breakout, but were either destroyed or captured. In every event, they had been pocketed and disposed of. As the Soviet offensive rolled to the west, the Kraut High Command threw in units drawn from anywhere and everywhere, but to no available. Now, later coordinated offensives in the north by the 2nd Baltic Front, you remember that a Red Army group is what the U.S. would call an army group, and in the south by the 1st Ukrainian Front, only added to German woes. By the end of August, the Red Army had established crossings on the Vistula and the Neru, and had overrun Vilnius and reached the border of East Prussia. The German Army Group North was now isolated, but Soviet offensive momentum stopped short of Warsaw, where Stalin apparently chose consciously not to support a rebellion against the German occupiers by Polish patriots beyond his control. And in all fairness, it should be pointed out that the London Poles, who were very anti-communist, triggered this Warsaw Revolt in order to stop the Red Army from coming in and setting up a government of the Warsaw Poles, which of course were all communists. Now, Bagration had enormous military and military consequences. It liquidated German Army Group Center and inflicted punishing losses on neighboring groups. It destroyed 2,000 German aircraft and 12 German divisions and brigades, while reducing to 1/2 the strength of another 50 divisions. Meanwhile, it opened the way for further Soviet offensives into Central Europe and the clearing of the Baltics. The cost to the Soviets was more than 178,000 dead and another 500,000 wounded. 1944 Bagration North saw a refinement of breakthrough and encirclement operations. The Red Army inserted mobile groups without pause into the depths of fascist defenses. Detailed planning for the Belarusian offensive of Bagration began in the spring of 1944. Knowledge of that operation was limited to the Stavka and 6 staff officers working on the plan. The launch date was June 22, 1944, soon after the U.S.-UK landing in France. Now, meanwhile, the Soviet armies involved in bloody fighting during the 43 winter and early 44 spring had made spectacular advances, particularly in the south. They had also driven the Germans away from the immediate area around Leningrad. And we're going to talk about the south in the next lecture. So after the Anglo-American Normandy landing, they were still over 600 miles from Berlin. The eastern bulge of the Nazi Army Group Center was 720 miles from Berlin. The distance from the rail junction city of Orsha, still in German hands, to Moscow was 240 miles. There was then the real prospect of Stalin having to cope alone with Germany for another year or two. On the other hand, the fascist armies in the east were bled white. Kraut withdrawal to shorter defensive lines in Poland was an advantage for them. To take that away, the Red Army would have to liberate the rest of East Europe containing the Nazis. At any rate, the USSR had 12 fronts, or 12 army groups, facing the Germans and their allies along a 1,900-mile front. The strength of the Red Army on the Eastern Front in the spring of 1944 stood at a little over 6 million. The fascists had 4 army groups and an independent army with a total strength of about 2.2 million facing the Red Army, so the Reds had a 3-to-1 superiority. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded Army Group Center. He was loyal and obedient to Hitler. His forces occupied a huge bulge extending eastward north of the Pripyat marshes. These were close to the headwaters of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers east of Vitebsk. That was the historic Russian invasion route called the Belarusian Balcony. Now in April 1944, Stavka settled on attacking the Balcony to destroy Army Group Center, bringing the Red Army to the border of Poland and East Prussia. Pressure, meantime, would be maintained on all the other fronts. So on April 1944, strategic and tactical deception led the Stavka to order the entire Red Army West to assume a defensive posture. Now Stavka knew this was not going to be believed by the German headquarters called OKW. However, they wanted the Kraut High Command to conclude that the Red strategic offensive would come in July against the southwestern part of the front. Indicators pointing to the area of Army Group North Ukraine as the location of the main effort. Red espionage proved that the Germans expected the strategic offensive to take place in Ukraine, not Belarusia. Therefore, the task of the deception effort was to reinforce that belief. Now, meanwhile, the Soviets had advanced to the border of Romania and past Kovel, near the Polish border in northwestern Ukraine, SSR, while Kraut Army Group North had been driven away from Leningrad to Lake Peipus. The Nazi Army Group Center had 700,000 troops in 51 divisions holding 468 miles. These were the 2nd, 9th, 4th, and 3rd Panzer Armies. The Nazi Army Group North, Ukraine, occupied a front of 210 miles with 45 divisions, including 10 Hungarian divisions. The 6th Air Fleet supported Army Group Center with 775 aircraft, of which 405 were long-range bombers not designed for defensive operations. Only 40 of its planes were fighters by June 22nd, and there was little gasoline to keep them in the air. The 4th Air Fleet, supporting Army Group North Ukraine, had 845 aircraft, of which 670 were fighters or ground support aircraft. Nevertheless, Red counterintelligence planted false signals data, making the Krauts think the Red offensive would be launched against Army Group North Ukraine. The OKW intelligence concluded that Army Group Center's area north of the Pripyat marshes would remain quiet. In May of 1944, much of the Army Group Center's strength was given to Model's Army Group North Ukraine. Now, the Red Army Stavka assembled 1.2 million frontline troops to throw against Army Group Center. These were backed up by a further 1.2 million troops further to the rear in Stavka Reserve, now to be used when their offensive kicked off. This buildup of forces opposite Army Group Center began in early May. In the first 3 weeks of June, 75,000 railroad carloads of troops and supplies were brought into the area opposite Army Group Center. The 4 Red Fronts, or Army Groups, opposite Army Group Center had an increase in men of 60% during May and June. There was a 300% increase in tanks and assault guns, and an 85% increase in artillery and mortars that was accompanied by a 62% increase in air strength. It was the most massive buildup of the entire war. The USSR assembled 4,000 tanks, 24,400 pieces of artillery, 5,300 aircraft. At kickoff, the Red assault targets had a 10-to-1 superiority in armor, artillery, and air power. Red Air always had air superiority and kept German reconnaissance aircraft at a distance except in areas they wanted the Germans to observe. Now the Reds concealed their buildup so well that it was not until the end of May that the Krauts began to detect an increase in the Soviet force level in the Army Group Center sector. Then reports of a Soviet buildup in the Army Group Center area increased rapidly in June. OKH chose to see these reports as a Soviet deception. On 5 May 1944, both Army Group Center and Army Group North Ukraine had become concerned about signs of buildup in the Kovel-Ternopil area on their joint border. The OKH intelligence branch thought it was possibly for a Soviet secondary offensive south of the Pripyat marshes. Then General Kurt Seitzler, OKW Chief of Staff, thought the secondary offensive would miss the Army Group Center that he had been reinforcing, sending its right flank, or 56th Panzer Corps, with tanks, assault guns, and artillery, thus to propose the formation of a reserve army in that area, drawing on units from Army Group Center and Army Group North. He recommended using the proposed reserve army with 56th Panzer Corps as its nucleus to launch a spoiling offensive. Model proposed to Hitler that he be assigned the 56th Panzer Corps for offensive operations, knowing Hitler preferred offense to defense. Thus 56th Panzer Corps was transferred to Army Group North Ukraine on the 20th of May. The movement of the boundary resulted in a 28-mile reduction in Army Group Center's sector. This minuscule reduction came at a high price because Army Group Center had reinforced 56th Panzer Corps heavily, and these reinforcements were all lost with the transfer of the Corps. Army Group Center lost 15% of its divisions, 3% of its assault guns, and a staggering 50 and 85% respectively of its artillery and tank strength. So in the first weeks of June 44, proof of looming disaster multiplied when new Soviet units were identified from dead Red Soldier uniforms. Worst of all, prisoner interrogation revealed that Marshal George Zhukov was in command of the new forces. Now, on the 14th of June 44, General Seitzler convened a high-level meeting at Rastenburg. Now, this was a week after the Anglo-American invasion of Normandy. Attending were the chiefs of staff of the army groups and armies and Hitler. Seitzler said the Soviets would continue their offensive against the southern army groups, with Army Group North Ukraine absorbing the brunt of the Soviet offensive. Now that was wrong. Now through their excellent deception plan, the Soviets had achieved one of the first requirements of a successful campaign, that being to get into the head of the opposing commander. Accordingly, the Germans continued to believe that the main offensive would take place against Army Group North Ukraine. On the 31st of May 44, the date of June 22, 1944 for the final offensive against the Krauts in the USSR was tentatively given. It was tentative because Stalin still did not know if his erstwhile allies were really going to go ashore at Normandy. In the event, they did, late as usual, on 6 June. At any rate, on June 22nd, migration would continue whether they went ashore or not. It was to be launched on a 288-mile front from just south of Polotsk on the boundary between the Army Group Center and Army Group North to Rogachev, near the boundary between the 4th and 9th Armies. Now, Marshal Zhukov and Alexander M. Vasilevsky were in charge of everything for the 4 Red Army groups. Zhukov had the 2 southern fronts, 2nd and 1st Belarusian, while Vasilevsky had the 2 northern fronts, 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian. On June 20th, 1944, 143,000 Belarusian partisans attacked Army Group Center's lines. The Nazis reacted by sending reinforcements south that the partisans allowed to pass unmolested, until these Krauts turned around after the main blow fell on Army Group Center. The partisans then killed them and paralyzed traffic in the Kraut rear. So, in the morning of June 22, 1944, as planned, an avalanche of Soviet forces struck Army Group Center. Their full fury was unleashed the next day. The Soviet plan worked so well in detail it unfolded exactly as planned. The four army groups destroyed the Kraut's four rear communication centers at Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobryansk. The operations against Vitebsk were primarily the responsibility of the 1st Baltic Front under General Ivan K. Bagramian. The 3rd Belarusian Front under General Ivan Cherniakovsky with the 5th Guards Army in reserve, assisted by enveloping Vitebsk from the south with the 5th and 39th Armies before heading towards Seno. Another assault group from the 3rd Belarusian Front, consisting of the 11th Guards and 31st Armies, attacked toward Orsha. Cavalry Mechanized Group Osokovsky made a rapid advance west past Seno. The 2nd Belarusian Front of the 33rd, 49th, and 50th Armies, under the command of General George F. Zakharov, hit the center of 4th Army and eliminated the German bridgehead east of the Dnieper River, going on to free Mogilev. General Konstantin Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front used two armies, the 3rd and 48th, east of the Beresina River, and two armies, 65th and 28th, and a cavalry mechanized group west of the Beresina to encircle Bobryansk. Now the breakthroughs were achieved by a massive infantry-led attacks with heavy artillery and air support against the Nazi lines on narrow fronts. 300 artillery pieces of indirect weapons per mile were used at each of the breakthrough points. When these holes were punched in the fascist lines, red armored spearheads rushed through and encircled the communication centers by double envelopment. The second phase of the Soviet operation involved deep armor-led drives against Minsk from both the northeast and southeast. These were designed to isolate the 4th German Army. Strong forces, that is the 3rd Belarusian Front, bypassed Minsk on the north and headed for Molodechno. Equally strong forces, the 1st Belarusian Front, headed for Boronovichi to the southwest of Minsk. Now these drives not only isolated the Kraut 4th Army, but blocked the escape routes from Minsk that were hemmed in by forests and swamps. 4th Army held a 24-mile deep and a 78-mile wide bridgehead east of the Dnieper River that tied into Army Group north of Rogachev. 9th Army held a front that curved southwestward along the Prut and Dnieper rivers to the area south of Zolblin, where it bent westward over the Beresina River to the lower Pitch and Pripet. 2nd Army held the longest sector along the Pripet River to where it tied to the left flank of the Army Group North Ukraine, north of Kovel. The 1st Baltic and 3rd Belarusian fronts, or army groups, quickly pierced the pulverized German front lines on both sides of the city of Vitebsk and proceeded with its envelopment. 3rd Panzer Army on the left flank of Army Group Center was caught completely by surprise by the Soviet 6th Guards Army, and its front was torn open. In this phase of the operation, the Soviets employed their vast air superiority against Kraut artillery. These Nazi guns, very vulnerable to air attack, as they were in the open near the front, being used firing over open sights. That is, pointed directly down, rather than the way you usually use artillery. On the second day, the Reds again overwhelmed the 3rd Panzer Army's front north of Vitebsk, proceeding to encircle the city from the north, thereby trapping 5 German divisions. Hitler's and Bush's fixation on rigid defense and holding on to areas designated as fortified places made an effective defense impossible. Now, meanwhile, the 3rd and 2nd Belarusian fronts were tearing through the 4th Army's front lines and heading for Orsha and Mogilev. On the 24th of June, 4th Army's left flank corps disintegrated under powerful Red attack. The 1st Belarusian front penetrated the 9th Army's lines near its northern boundary. The Soviets reached Seno in the 3rd Panzer Army sector, where they turned south behind the 4th Army's left flank. Hitler gave permission to withdraw 4 of the 5 divisions trapped at Vitebsk, but it was too late. The Nazi commander of the 4th Army requested permission to abandon the bridgehead east of the Dnieper River, but he was refused. The following day he took matters into his own hands and ordered the withdrawal. On the 25th of June 1944, Ninth Army, in danger of having its main force trapped between the Dnieper and Beresina rivers, requested permission to withdraw before it was destroyed, but that permission was refused. Which brings us to the end of Army Group Center. By the morning of June 26, 1944, Army Group Center was falling apart and had no more reserves. Vitebsk was encircled, and Kraut forces there were lost. 3rd Panzer Army was driven back on the Dvina and Ula rivers, 50 miles west of Vitebsk. The right flank corps of the 3rd Panzer Army badly mauled remnants of 5 divisions, and it was in full flight west and south of Seto and had lost contact with the rest of the army. In 9th Army sector, the Soviet armies were at Bobryansk on both sides of the city. The lead Soviet elements in the south were 3 miles from the city center. Repeated requests by 9th Army to be allowed to withdraw to Bobryansk and the Beresina River were denied until the morning of June 27th. However, that was too late, and anyway, OKH countermanded that permission. OKH and Bush changed their minds again in the afternoon. General Hans Jordan, commander of the 9th Army, got permission for a breakout to the north, but was ordered to hold Bobryansk. The Krauts could not keep up with the speed of events. Then 10 Soviet divisions, that's about 200,000 men, encircled Bobryansk, trapping 2 German corps of about 70,000 men in the east of the city. Panic broke out among the thousands of leaderless German troops in Bobryansk as they milled around in confusion. 9th Army headquarters, located outside the pocket, transferred its 1 remaining operational corps to the 4th Army and withdrew themselves to Marina Gorka. There it tried to hold open an avenue of escape for the 4th Army, using parts of the 12th Panzer Division. The 9th Kraut Army was then ground to pieces in the Red Offensive, its men dead, wounded on the ground, or hightailing it anywhere but here. The end of the 9th Army was symptomatic of the end of all the other parts of Army Group Center. General Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front was taking Minsk and the city of Slutsk to its south. Zakharov's 2nd Belarusian Front forced a crossing of the Dnieper River north of Mogilev that same day. The Kraut 4th Army could only run away on 1 bridge across the Beresina. It was ordered to establish a line on the Prut River, but to hold fortified places of Mogilev and Orsha were to be held at all cost. But the Red Army was already in Orsha, and the soldiers of the 4th Army ended up in the swamps facing partisans who were very anxious to kill them. Thus ended the 4th Army of Army Group Center. OKH still clung to the belief that another, more powerful offensive would strike Army Group North Ukraine and proposed to pull Army Group North back to a line running from Dvesk to Riga. Now Hitler ignored the proposal. He sacked Bush and appointed Field Marshal Model to command both Army Group Center and Army Group North Ukraine. So on the 29th of June 1944, Soviet aircraft knocked out the only bridge across the Beresina River. The 1st and Belarusian fronts were outflanking the pathetic remnants of Germany's 4th Army from the north and south. The Red Army captured both Borisov and Slutsk. And then the next day, on 30 June 1944, Soviet tanks and artillery came within range of the bridge over the Beresina. The tanks and motorized units from Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front drove past Slutsk and Borisov toward Baranovichi and Molodechno. Now this caused Jordan's 9th Army headquarters to leave Marina Gorka and head for Stoltzy, halfway between Baranovich and Minsk. It hoped to hold a crossing over the Niemen River, the last escape route from Minsk. The 5th Guards Tank Army was getting close in the north. Jordan directed his only remaining Panzer Division against the Stolby from Marina Gorka, but the Soviets had already captured the town. On the 3rd of July 1944, troops from the 1st and Belarusian fronts took Minsk. On the next day, the 4th of July 1944, Ninth Army tried to open the bridge at Stolpsy and failed while the Reds drove toward Baranovici. After that, the only German troops to escape were individuals and small groups that made their way through the dense Nalaboka forest. Not very many of them escaped the wrath of the partisans that took exception to their wish to live. Ninth Army held the pocket around Minsk long enough for its 12,500 men to run away. And that's all it had left anyway. After 12 days confronting the Red Army, Kraut Army Group Center ceased to exist. Hitler lost at least 50 divisions and all their men and materiel, which is, 500,000 men? Stavka ordered their offensive to continue without cessation on a broad front. The First Baltic Front was ordered to advance toward Dvinsk. The Third Belarusian Front was aimed at Bolodekno and the Niemen River. The First Belarusian Front advanced on Baranovici and then onto the city of Brest. And the Second Belarusian Front remained behind in the Minsk area to conduct mopping up operations. Victorious Soviet soldiers, riding on tanks and trucks, paraded past the government building in Minsk, the capital of White Russia. And Minsk was liberated on the 11th day of Operation Bagration North, the USSR phase. On the 6th of July 1944, the Third Belarusian Front penetrated the Narrows, south and east of Mododekno, and the road to Vilnius was opened. On the 8th of July 1944, the Red Army liberated Baranovici. The 4th Shock and 6th Guard armies from the First Baltic Front then advanced toward Dvinsk. Model informed OKH that he would try to stop the Russians along the line from the Kaunas along the Niemen River to Brest. To do so, he needed the panzer divisions that Hitler had planned for the northward drive, and even then he would have only 16 divisions, near full strength, to counter 160 Soviet divisions and brigades. On the 14th of July, Hitler agreed to let Model have the divisions to stop the Soviet offensive. He was then to use them offensively, however, to plug the gap between the two army groups. However, he rejected the idea of withdrawing Army Group North. The 4th Army and 3rd Panzer Army were able to establish a line from Ukmerge through Kanath along the Niemen River, south of Grondo. The 2nd Army continued its pivot, its left flank, as it withdrew toward Bialystok. 9th Army was in the rear, reorganizing and preparing defensive works to protect East Prussia. The Red Army advanced 200 miles and outran its supplies. Railroads, bridges, and roads had to be rebuilt or repaired before they could drive further. So on the 17th of July 1944, the Soviets paraded 57,000 German prisoners through Moscow, proving the extent of the Red Army victories, and that the Wehrmacht claimed it had conducted a planned withdrawal from Belorussia was a bold-faced lie. It was not until 18 July 1944 that the North Americans captured St. Lo, just 18 miles from Omaha Beach. By then, the Soviet offensive had covered 200 miles. All this while the million-men U.S. First and British Second Army were bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy. The facts spoke for themselves, and the world knew it was the Red Army winning the war, not the Gringo-Limey cabal. On 19 July 1944, the U.S. Army took St. Lo, and the failed attempt on Hitler's wildlife was made at Rastenburg that same day by an anti-Hitler conspiracy within the Kraut Army. That conspiracy was decrypted by local Nazi intelligence thugs and resulted in a Kraut Army Officer Corps shakeup on the Western Front, but not on the Eastern Front. On 21 July 1944, 2 days later, Guderian was appointed successor to Zeitzler. On the 23rd of June 1940, 2 days after that, General Schorner, commander of Army Group South Ukraine, replaced General Feistner. And meanwhile, Kraut radio monitors intercepted a Soviet order to their tank units north of Vilnius, indicating another and greater catastrophe on the Eastern Front. Stavka instructed the Red Army to attack the gap between what was left of Army Group Center and North. This initiated the next phase of the Soviet offensive. The Red Army pressured German flanks as it rebuilt access roads and bridges and resupplied its fighting units. Nevertheless, the fascists could not assemble an attack force in time to stop the Soviet drive, and that Army Group North had to manage on its own. The end of Army Group North, the Polish road to Berlin opened. Now the conditions in Army Group North were just as bad, as it had no reserves left and was about to collapse. Goering said the only way to keep Army Group North from being encircled and destroyed was to withdraw behind the Dvina River and establish a line between Riga and Kaunas. Hitler said this would cost Germany the Latvian oil, Swedish iron ore, and Finnish nickel. As it turned out, all that would be lost anyway in a few weeks. Therefore, at that time, Hitler insisted that Army Group North would have to stay in place. Now, Stavka was not into waiting at all and ordered Red Army General Bagramian to drive on Latvia. His attack, using his army group plus 2 new Crimean armies, the 2nd Guards Army and the 51st Army, was Riga. He blasted a hole in the northern flank of the pathetic remnants of Army Group Center and Army Group North. Simultaneously, the pressure on the southern flank opposite Army Group North Ukraine was delivered by Marshal Ivan S. Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front with 10 armies, 3 of them tank armies. Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front on Konev's right had been reinforced by a Guards Army and a tank army, as well as the 1st Polish Army's 4 divisions. Now these armies made a three-pronged drive to Brest and Lublin in the north, Lvov in the center, and Stanislav in the south. On 13 July 1944, the offensive against Army Group North Ukraine began. This Lvov-Sendomirsk action took weeks of bloody fighting. On 18 July 1944, converging red tank columns reached the Bug River 30 miles west of Lvov. They pocketed 6 German divisions of the 13th Corps east of Lvov, from which 5,000 Krauts panicked and escaped. 1st Panzer Army at Lvov was encircled. Now, Army Group North Ukraine ran to the Bug River because of the breakthroughs in the south. The Reds forced the Bug and created a bridgehead on the west bank of Kelm, Poland, on 20 July. The 2nd Army North ran away to Brest, where it went into defensive postures 2 days later on July 22nd. The Soviets drove on to Lublin, 50 miles to the west. They bypassed that town and headed southwestward in the morning of July 23rd. So between July 18th and 21st of 1944, the Baltic Front had created several bridgeheads across the Niemen River, while other forces were pushing the left flank of the 3rd Panzer Army south. In the north, 3rd Panzer Army was now out of luck at Kaunas. The division on its left flank disintegrated under continuous Red attack by 6 divisions of the 2nd Guard Army. A 35-mile gap was formed on the left flank of the 3rd Panzer Army, and 2nd Guards Army poured through it on the July 22nd. The Red spearhead reached 48 miles behind 3rd Panzer by that evening, and it was destroyed. 13,850 men became POWs. On 19 July 1944, the 16th Army on the right flank of Army Group North had withdrawn to Lithuania. However, it could not hold and ran another 9 miles on July 22nd. Army Group North Ukraine's 1st Panzer Army was still holding at Lvov, but Soviet forces had pressed the 4th Panzer Army to the vicinity of the San and Vistula rivers. It was fragmented and had to withdraw behind the Vistula and San rivers to avoid encirclement and destruction. But Guderian and Hitler would not allow this. In the last week of July, the Soviet armies were still rolling west through a shattered German line from the Baltic to the Carpathians. On July 24, 1944, several crack Soviet armies were closing on the San River, 50 miles west of Lvov, between Jaroslav and Przemyśl. On the 25th of July 44, the 4th Soviet Tank Army crossed the San, forcing 1st Red Panzer Army to withdraw from Lvov toward the Carpathians on the 27th of July. The Kraut 4th Panzer Army retreated along the Wipers River southeast of Lublin. However, the Reds had torn a hole of 60 miles in the south and another hole of 70 miles in the north. 4th Panzer ran behind the Vistula River. The 2nd Army of pathetic remnants of Army Group Center tried a defense at Brest, but the 2nd Soviet Tank Army was racing north towards Sicily, arriving in its rear on July 24. 2 Soviet armies simultaneously hit its southern flank. OKW ordered the 9th German Army to defend Warsaw with only 1 division. Rokossovsky's armored columns easily penetrated this thin force and reached the east bank of the Vistula at Deblin and Pulowe. Motorized Soviet columns were pouring west from Panevėžys behind Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army. On the 25th of July 1944, 2nd Army reported that it could no longer hold Brest, but was encircled. Bagramian's motorized columns, which had passed 3rd Panzer Army's left flank, turned north and in a 48-mile night dash captured Jelgava and cut the last rail link to now fictional Army Group North. 3rd Panzer Army itself, in trouble, did not have adequate forces to halt the Soviet advance. 9 rifle divisions and 2 Guards Tank Corps fell on the right flank of 3rd Panzer Army south of Kaunas on the 29th of July. On the same day, Rokossovsky's tanks drove north past Warsaw. Soviet forces were within 6.5 miles of that city in the southeast and had captured Wollern, 12 miles to the northeast. On the 30th of July 44, 3rd Panzer Army's flank collapsed and the Soviet advanced to Mariampol, only 18 miles from the East Prussian border. General Reinhardt withdrew his troops during the night behind the Nevayasa River, 9 miles to the west. And then on the next day, the 31st of July 44, Soviet mechanized forces reached the Gulf of Riga, trapping what was left of Army Group North. In the Warsaw area, the 8th Guards Army seized a bridgehead near Magnusu, while the 1st Tank Army began ferrying troops and tanks across the Vistula at Baranau. Now the Reds came onto the Kraut so fast and drove so far, they ran out of supplies. They stopped at the Baltic, and the tanks in front of Warsaw area ground to a halt short of gasoline. Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Army Group did not move against East Prussia through the gap between Mariampol and Kaunas after it captured Vilkaviškis, 9 miles from the border, the Soviets having advanced in some places more than 145 miles since the capture of Minsk and about 335 miles since the beginning of the operation in all, and had simply outrun their supplies. On the 1st August of 1944, the London anti-communist Poles launched their Warsaw Uprising to stop a takeover by the Moscow Poles, who of course were all communists. Stalin had no interest in helping the London Poles. It was time to resupply anyway, so it was a simple choice to make for the Reds. Let the anti-communist Poles handle the situation they had created. Meanwhile, the Krauts took advantage of the Red slowdown. Model took advantage of the Soviet slowdown and established a continuous 400-mile front from around Shalye to the Vistula near Pulowe. Then 39 fascist divisions and brigades faced 1/3 of the Red Army strength on the Reds' western front. On the 3rd August of 1944, Model sent Hitler an optimistic report. He said that by August 15th he would assemble sufficient forces to attack and reestablish contact with Army Group North, but this was a subterfuge for the imminent collapse of that so-called Army Group's collapse to be blamed on Hitler. On the 16th of August 1945 witnessed a renewed Red Army offensive featuring the 3rd Belarusian Front, 3 armies attacking the right flank of the 3rd Panzer Army. As August ended in the zones of Army Groups North, Center, and North Ukraine, the Soviet armies took up a defensive posture, ending the 1944 offensive. The Soviets had bridgeheads on the Vistula and Baranau and at Magnus, Siroc, and Rosanne. On the 2nd of October 1944, the anti-Red insurgents in Warsaw capitulated to the Nazis. Bagration North had cost the Kraut Army about a quarter of its Eastern Front manpower. German losses were 300,000 killed or missing, 120,000 captured, 250,000 wounded, and an enormous and irreplaceable loss of equipment. The Krauts never recovered from the disaster between Vitebsk and Warsaw. The final destruction of 3 armies of Army Group Center was the most calamitous defeat suffered by the Germans in World War II. The Soviets could still sit calmly on the Vistula, reorganizing and resupplying their forces, supremely confident of their ability to drive to the Oder and Neisse rivers and on to Berlin. The Reds were supremely confident because while the Red Army had been winning the war in the north that we have just reviewed, it had also been winning in the south, liberating the Balkans and East Central Europe that we're going to review in the next lecture. And that brings us to a conclusion of this one.